Practicum team, part of the UCLA IOES Senior Practicum for the 2025-2026 year. And this is our team. I'm Anicia Acosta.
I'm Leah Acosta.
I'm Celeste Alberon.
I'm Naya Bender.
I'm Tatuan Four.
I'm Sanaya Faust.
I'm Zoe Katz.
I'm Riley Rogers.
I'm Alvaro Villarreal.
I'm Lauren Wiley, and this is our team.
Okay, so I will be doing the introduction. Can we do the next slide, please? So these are some of the important concepts for our project. To begin, islands are uniquely situated in that their isolation causes the species that inhabit them to evolve separately from their mainland counterparts and creates hubs of biodiversity and endemic species. This isolation, however, results in greater rates of extinction and can also make native species extremely vulnerable to invasive species. Endemic insular species of vegetation may evolve without predators, leaving them to have little to no defense against herbivory. Invasive species that are introduced to these delicate ecosystems and overgraze the vegetation destroy habitats and food sources of other species and cause trophic cascades. As researchers, it is important to study and preserve islands because their distinct ecosystems are critical for global climate resilience and human well-being, and their isolated, self-contained nature allows scientists to study processes of evolution, colonization, and extinction. So this is our table of contents, and we'll be going over 8 different research questions that cover these topics.
Our first research question goes into mule deer and what we know about them. So next slide, please. This is just a summary of the background knowledge that we gathered from the articles that we read. So mule deer are ecologically flexible. They are widespread. They occupy a variety of habitats across diverse geography, and they have substantial morphological and genetic variation across their range. As invasive species on Santa Catalina Island specifically, they were released for hunting. They've persisted for decades and have reached varying densities in the absence of native predators. They've caused ecological harm that stems from factors such as overbrowsing, alteration of vegetation structure, loss or reduction of native plant species, and broader ecosystem level effects. Based on historical biogeographic events that led to separation, isolation, and genetic divergence, there is evidence of substructure within each lineage that demonstrates island vicariance. We are aware of at least 2 main morphological types within the species, which are mule deer and blacktail. In terms of how seasonal fluctuations in rainfall, vegetation, or other features that affect their movement or distribution, we found that factors such as nutrition, environmental variability, anthropogenic disturbance, and habitat change strongly shape mule deer life history, migrations, and demographics. Isolated ecosystems are especially vulnerable to herbivory and ecological disruption because they lack evolved defenses. So introduced ungulates pose a conservation threat and lead to reduced vegetation diversity, structural changes, and cascading effects on native species. Next slide.
So the fundamental biology and life history of this species is pretty well documented in research, particularly for mainland populations, and specifically regarding how nutritional conditions and variations in the environment affect survival and reproduction. There was also a lot of knowledge regarding their movement patterns and their reliance on spatial memory and migration in response to surface disturbances. This also is in regard to mainland studies. Next slide.
Within our research, we did find a few gaps and controversies. There is a significant gap when applying mainland models to the Santa Catalina Island population. Mainland deer are migratory and respond to winter precipitation, whereas Catalina deer are geographically constrained and non-migratory. Catalina mule deer were also found to congregate in riparian habitats during dry periods, but there is a lack of recent high-resolution data on how current climate change trends of longer droughts and or extreme wet years alter the specific island distribution patterns collected in the early 2000s. An area of uncertainty and possible controversy is the genetic status of mule deer. Research indicates that insular mule deer populations can become genetically distinct, potentially representing unique subspecies. The deer are ecologically invasive and destructive to rare endemic plant species, yet they also may possess genetic distinctiveness due to their isolation. This creates a paradox where the species is both a biological threat to the island and a potential population in need of preservation. Next.
This research surrounding mule deer biology and ecology is important for developing sustainable management strategies for the mule deer on Santa Catalina Island. If the genetic research forces our project to address the legal and ethical implications of management. The project must determine if the ecological damage described in the literature outweighs the value of the Catalina mule deer's genetic uniqueness. If the deer are genetically distinct and considered an endemic subspecies, the Catalina Island Conservancy may face regulatory issues that do not apply to standard pests. It becomes a more delicate process if deer are not just invasive, but a different species that cannot just be eliminated. The data regarding seasonal movement and habitat selection provides a blueprint for current management efforts. Knowing that deer congregate in riparian areas during drought and avoid areas with high invasive grass cover allows the Conservancy and our project to target interventions spatially and temporally. Instead of treating the whole island uniformly, we can focus on high-use zones to maximize efficiency. Understanding the mule deer biology helps us greatly in developing a plan to protect the endemic ecosystem, but also consider the implications for the deer species on Catalina Island.
Okay, so our second question was about the relationship between deer, ticks, Lyme disease, and lizards. Next slide, please. So there are preferred hosts for ticks and their reproduction, and lizards and deers are preferred hosts for tick reproduction, and them having high population numbers directly supports tick populations, even though neither actually can transmit the Lyme disease bacteria to the ticks. And deer tend to support larger tick populations than lizards because there's more space on the deer. And they tend to also outcompete the lizards by eating their habitat, especially the deer on Catalina, which tend to overgraze large areas. And deer can affect tick populations directly, and which may concern Catalina Islanders with their concern for Lyme disease. And their complete versus partial removal of the deer in Catalina is also up for question because some studies find that deer's effect on Lyme disease is only relevant if there were few deer in an area before a massive population increase, or if the deer are completely eradicated. And there is also uncertainty on to what extent the deer populations affect Lyme disease, because when the deer are not completely eradicated, there are mixed results on whether or not it actually lessens disease rates in humans, and only it will only reduce tick numbers if there are few hosts around for the ticks to migrate to, and if there are many lizards around, eradicating the mule deer does not actually decrease the amount of ticks that are able to spread Lyme disease. And for mule deer range, if if the deer overgraze open areas, they will be more likely to move into human populated areas, such as people's lawns. And when they carry Lyme disease carrying ticks, that introduces a new vector pathway for humans to get Lyme disease, which, if by removing many of the mule deer, would significantly decrease human chances and human interactions with ticks, or possibly getting ticks via their animals or pets. And this is only relevant, though, if the deer are actually entering these areas, and that would also need to be further studied at how often they interact with deer. Next, please.
Now, our third question was looking at how invasive species, particularly the mule deer, interact in island settings with the ecosystem, and just how island settings are different from mainland settings. So, first off, the invasive mule deer is considered an extra-local species because they are native to the mainland but invasive to Catalina Island. And most of their impacts are on the island vegetation. So, a lot of Catalina's native island vegetation evolved without any predators, and so they have a lot, the plants have a lot less defenses than mainland plants. And so, because of this, mule deer will often overgraze these native plants on the island, making it decreasing their reproductive success and overall increasing the mortality of native plants, which in turn helps invasive grasses and other invasive plants from the mainland gain a competitive advantage over native island plants, therefore often replacing native island vegetation with invasive vegetation. So invasive species like the mule deer are definitely a large driver of extinction rates on the island, especially for endemic plant species. And it really helps give invasive plants a competitive advantage. There's some gaps on the research specifically on Catalina, and so we can kind of complement these gaps because there just haven't been that many studies done using other islands, as there's a lot of other islands that have faced issues with invasive deer, such as the Hawaiian Islands, as well as other Channel Islands, which have faced grazing from invasive ungulates and invasive deer. So yeah, next slide. So how a island can particularly affect mule deer movement compared to the mainland. There's a lot of gaps here, but one of the main findings that we found is that precipitation has a large impact on the distribution because of it influences where primary producers are, like plants. And so as deer migrate, usually they follow those primary producers. This hasn't really been researched on island settings, but it's possible that like a similar trend might exist. And also because of deer have a very very high reproductive rate and are very agile and like very flexible to their ecosystem, their removal is a lot more complicated, which makes it a lot more challenging in an island. So some gaps, particularly pertaining to Catalina, is how other abiotic factors might affect mule deer distribution, so if droughts, climate, and things like that. Also, Catalina's distinct geography, if that might impact mule deer, like if there might be any barriers to their movement, as it's a very different geography from the mainland. And then finally, how does the distribution of mule deer affect the native vegetation and ecosystems on Catalina? Because some of their effects have been studied on like vegetation, but the impact of like deer movement and how they're distributed across the island hasn't been well researched as much.
The next question talks about what Catalina's ecosystem looked like before mule deer were introduced, what endemic plants existed, and how island plants evolved without natural herbivores. We also looked at current literature on loss of defenses in island plants, where species become vulnerable because they never evolved thorns, spines, or other deterrents. Next slide. So what we currently know is that Catalina evolved without any native large mammalian herbivores, making the flora distinct and more fragile than their mainland counterparts. Historical surveys provide detailed records of the island's vegetation before major anthropogenic changes and before the mule deer population existed and exploded. Evidence from paleontology and natural history allows us to establish a baseline control ecosystem for comparison with present-day conditions. Once mule deer were introduced, the island experienced overgrazing, loss of rare and endemic plants and shrubs, shifts in canopy structure, and the decline of native species. Next. Next slide, please. These are some examples of endemic flora. So we know that vegetation history was fairly well studied. It's well documented with research stretching back almost a century. The evolutionary loss of plant defenses is studied, but still less covered. But recent sources do confirm that there are reduced structural and chemical defenses in Catalina shrubs, some of which are shown right here. Next slide. Uh, you can see with these pictures the key differences in these two flower shrubs, and it shows how like island species have larger leaf sizes and fewer spines, which make them more susceptible and vulnerable to herbivory, especially by the mule deer. Whereas mainland shrubs have more defenses against these large predators that they've developed over time. Um, the biggest gap in research and understanding is that we can no longer observe the pre-mule deer ecosystem on the island. So researchers have to rely on old vegetation surveys and fossil evidence. Additional detailed data on historical species composition would be helpful, but it's not recoverable right now. Aside from that, there is still a strong consensus that mule deer are harmful to the endemic flora. Next slide. And finally, some of the management for endemic flora is shown here with the exclosures and the exclosures post-fire. So current conservation strategies include these fenced-off areas for habitat restoration and deer population control. Bottom-up strategies, such as fencing the plants from the ground up towards the sky, have shown success in post-fire recovery studies, especially after the 1999 Goat Harbor fire, which is shown on the right. These studies showed that when deer are excluded, rare species can regenerate, proving that the seed bank is still viable post-fire. This is relevant to our project because understanding the island before and after mule deer helps us with a baseline to compare current vegetation patterns. Knowing which species survived, disappeared, or declined help us predict deer movement and feeding ranges, which is central to our mapping objective. The research on loss of defenses explains why why deer browsing is so ecologically devastating, which strengthens our argument for management intervention. Studies on bottom-up restoration help us evaluate whether combining that approach with top-down deer control strategy could create a stronger feedback loop for management. And the research also supports community education and engagement of our project by providing scientific justification for controlling mule deer despite public attachment. Next slide.
So next we're going to be talking about the landscape of fear. Um, Next slide. The landscape of fear is an ecological concept that many conservationists utilize in order to better understand the spatiotemporal patterns of a species of interest, as well as to predict processes like habitat selection and inform ecosystem dynamics. It's basically just a concept where a prey species, resource, or habitat selection is based on predictable patterns of perceived predation risk across a particular landscape, and the LOF analyzes and compares costs and benefits of certain foraging or safety behaviors that emerge as a result of the species' ability to detect threats. So this framework is important for community ecology studies as it plays a powerful role in informing us on the behavior and movement of prey, which has a huge impact on the structure of the ecosystems that they inhabit. Some controversies arose when we were researching this because some researchers would focus on prey perception of risk, while others would focus on actual observed anti-predator response, which led to the improper use of proxies in some studies. However, one paper addressed this ambiguity by creating a clear definition that regards it as the spatial variation in prey perception of predation risk, which emphasizes that we are really looking at an animal's perceived risk. This is important to note because the landscape of fear can be used even when there's no actual risk present, but can still be effective if something triggers the species to behave like there is. So there's a few different models that we use to quantify the landscape of fear spatially. Researchers have previously used the mean rate of change of continued foraging over space as a variable to illustrate the landscape of fear. Also, modes like telemetry data and resource selection functions are common models of determining a species' landscape of fear. We'll get into resource selection functions a little bit more later, but it's basically just a model of species suitable habitat. And these models are commonly created using telemetry data, which is just GPS or sensor tags that transmit data like location, movement, and behavior. And these two vices in conjunction are pretty effective in determining a species' landscape of fear because it helps us see where they locate, move, and how they behave, which offers us an opportunity to better understand the LOF with spatial quantification through habitat selection. Next slide, please. So, what does this have to do with our research here in Catalina? Well, the framework of understanding and quantifying the landscape of fear can be applied to the island. However, it looks a little bit different because mule deer don't have any natural predators. But this perceived risk can form the basis of the landscape of fear, that the mule deer doesn't necessarily have to come from natural predation. It can be from a variety of different types of danger outside of their like natural ecological predator patterns. So in Catalina, this pressure has been observed to result from hunting, which generates patterns similar to ones that we see in a typical landscape of fear model. Research has shown that hunting produces both direct and indirect effects on the mule deer, indicating shifting their movement patterns, increasing their vigilance, altering their foraging behavior, and even changing their habitat selection. Basically, we just make them scared. So they view us as predators. And it's sad, but it works. So one study found that a female mule deer increase their movement rates in areas with higher perceived hunting risk and even in areas that were familiar to them, which indicates some risk perception had occurred and they moved and adapted accordingly, which aligns with what we would want from a common landscape of fear model. Human presence alone, even outside of hunting, can alter their perception of risk and response. Deer living near heavily used human areas have been observed to become habituated and less afraid of human proximity, which isn't what we want. So yeah, the application of this framework to Catalina through hunting-induced fear-based spatial patterns could produce an effectively um, and replace natural predation as the foundation of the landscape of fear model, which would allow the mule deer on Catalina to be shaped not only by this harmful top-down trophic interaction that we currently see, but also by human-mediated risk zones that can alter these top-down effects and promote the health of native species in the area.
Our next question talked about extinctions, islands, and the relationship between the two. So our research found that there are four main forces driving island extinction. However, remember that island species face disproportionately high extinction rates due to a number of reasons, like high numbers of endemic species, small geographic ranges, low population sizes. But it isn't due to them being quote unquote biologically weaker. Their vulnerability comes from these external factors. In order of how greatly they impact island species, the first being introduced mammalian predators. These are mammals like the mule deer on Catalina Island, brought to the island usually for human purposes, that typically have no natural predators. Their populations grow unchecked and predate on endemic species until populations collapse. The second is direct hunting and exploitation, which affects both plants and animals. As Sanaya just talked about, the hunting on Catalina Island does play a major role in the deer and how they move about the island, and that plays a role in how they feed on the island, the native island plants. The habitat destruction, this usually comes and happens as humans convert the land for different uses, and then deforestation and agriculture sort of degrade the soil richness, which then puts native plants in a vulnerable position where they're unable to adapt to the changing landscape of the island. The last is the genetic factors. As we talked about previously in our report, island species, as opposed to their mainland counterparts, don't evolve and adapt to different outside sources. And so they're a lot more vulnerable because they don't experience those. And due to that, they are at a higher rate of extinction. We also found that there's a sequential phase model of island extinction, with the first being pre-settlement visitation, which is when invasive predators arrive and extinctions begin before human settlement even takes place. The next is initial prehistoric settlement, which is when commensals such as dogs, rats, and pigs are introduced. And these are the driving sources of many of your ground level species, like megafauna, ground nesting birds, and insects. And then the final phase is European colonization, which can be described as huge habitat loss, intensification, and drastic land changes. And it's really important to understand what the three of these are because there's a different level of conservation effort as opposed to like independence on which phase you're in and different strategies that one can employ. We also found that there are different taxonomic patterns that are important to understand on for island species because that determines how we can look forward for our Catalina project. For birds and vertebrates, they undergo quick extinctions, often forced by predation, and these are usually well documented. Whereas opposed to plants, it's really hard. It's not well documented. They're sometimes facing extinction debt or ecosystemic resiliency, but it's really hard to understand because there's a huge lack of documentation and data on this. Extinction debt is um, when what's it called when we don't see the extinction and record the extinction as quickly because its effects are felt later. They're not as immediate as, say, a bird going extinct, and that is causing conservationists to react slower and therefore not be as successful. And it's important to understand the relationship between islands and extinction patterns because island species are not the same as their mainland counterpart, and therefore they act differently, and we have to go about protecting those species in a different way.
So next, I'll be talking about resource selection functions and how spatial data is analyzed and interpreted to describe them. You can go to the next slide. So resource selection functions, or RSFs, are statistical models that describe how animals choose the habitats they use. The core idea is that RSFs estimate the relative probability that an animal selects one habitat unit over another. To do that, RSFs compare GPS locations where an animal was actually observed, which are called used points, to a set of available points representing the habitat that was accessible but not necessarily chosen. Next slide, please. RSFs are essential because they tell us which environmental features animals prefer or avoid. This helps ecologists understand species habitat requirements, movement patterns, and potential conflicts with human activity. RSFs are widely used with modern GPS collar data and are the foundation for more complex models like step selection functions. In management context, RSFs help identify critical habitats and inform conservation planning. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Oh, there we go. Building an RSF starts with collecting spatial data. GPS or VHF locations give the used points. We then generate available points, which represent the habitat the animal could have chosen. Next, we extract habitat information from GIS layers for both sets of points, including things like vegetation type, slope, and DVI, distance to roads, or terrain ruggedness. Finally, we fit a statistical model, typically logistic regression, which estimates how each habitat variable influences selection. The output describes which features increase or decrease the probability of use. Next slide, please. Once the RSF is built, we interpret the model coefficients. Positive coefficients indicate habitat features that are selected, while negative coefficients indicate avoidance. These results are often visualized by creating maps that show the relative probability of use across the landscape. However, results must be interpreted carefully. RSF maps represent relative, not absolute probability. Many of our sources that we read in order to answer this question, they indicated that the scale can completely change RSF patterns. They also warned us that misidentifying availability can bias the results, especially with GPS data that are spatially autocorrelated. Next slide, please. So for our Catalina mule deer management project, RSFs are especially valuable. By modeling which habitat features deer select, we can identify high-use areas and movement corridors on the island. This helps us understand why deer concentrate in certain places and how they interact with vegetation in human-modified areas. These RSF maps that can guide the eradication strategies and support restoration planning by showing where deer pressure is greatest. Ultimately, RSFs provide a quantitative, spatially explicit foundation for making management decisions that support ecological recovery on Catalina. Next slide, please.
So our eighth and final research question was on generalized linear mixed models, or GLMMs, and specifically how we can use them to relate GPS location data to habitat variables. Generalized linear mixed models are a combination of linear mixed models and generalized linear models. And this combination allows for the analysis of non-normal data while also taking into account random effects. Next slide, please. Okay, so why is there a need for this? Well, in ecology, the data used involves dynamic systems yielding non-normal data, which is difficult to interpret correctly using conventional statistical methods. One example of this is wildlife location data generated through the use of GPS tracking. GPS telemetry has given way to large data sets, which house extensive records of wildlife whereabouts, making them a challenge to analyze. The term random effects used earlier is typically used in tandem with GLMMs. Random effects can take into account the variation in data that exists across units, like populations or individuals. And in GPS data, these can include technical errors like repeat recordings of animal position or more natural biases like individual responses to environmental factors, which may not always be representative of the overall population behavior. Studies have shown that GLMMs model habitat selection in a way that maintains statistical validity despite the presence of these random effects, which would otherwise be misinterpreted through more common statistical methods. GLMMs are generally uncontroversial and very well applied in ecology. However, they can be misused. Studies have highlighted that a primary place of confusion for using GLMMs is the software employed for data analysis. So software like R, which house special packages for these models, can be misunderstood and can lead to incorrect interpretations of the data. So seeing as how GLMMs have been heavily used over the years, there are now resources that exist which detail best practices for avoiding these kind of mistakes and other possible statistical errors with using GLMMs. Next slide, please.
With these many years of GLMM use in different studies, our research has shown us that these models may allow us to map out and give statistical meaning to seemingly unpredictable or random data, including the movement data of mule deer on Catalina. In that case, the seemingly randomness of mule deer movement is what statistical tools like GLMMs utilize to find relationships and help us better understand these animals. These models have also been tools for previous studies to understand relevant animal behaviors, like a population's habitat selection, behavior change in response to hunting, and more, all of which are important when we're attempting to manage a population. So, for example, in a study by Moreau and Associates, they utilized GLMMs to understand how caribou responded to roads and areas of logging, which need to consider different factors of caribou behavior, like response to food availability, their seasonality, and their landscape of fear. Caribou are also a threatened species, so this study understanding their habitat selection with GLMMs was key to informing conservation efforts. Inversely to the study, we may actually be able to use GLMMs to understand areas on Catalina that mule deer don't want to utilize as habitat and how that may inform conservation efforts to protect native Catalina species. And important to note, GLMMs will be a tool used to analyze our data, and it is a tool which is constantly used in current studies and better understand with each of these new studies. Our project may be able to inform other conservation projects on how they may use and approach GLMMs with their ecological data. And there is also a need for caution, as Leah has pointed out, as the programs we use for GLMMs must be properly understood to avoid any mistakes in our analysis. We also expect to possibly make changes to the components of any GLMMs we may use to better fit our data that we'll be collecting and analyzing. And GLMMs are not the only statistical tools we may use, like resource selection functions, as Lauren discussed, but GLMM's potential make them applicable and useful as tools for helping us address the mule deer on Catalina Island. Next slide, please. Thank you.